So then there's activist labour history, what I like to call a red band view of Australian history. Not a black band view, but a red band view. And that starts with the way in which the indigenous population of Australia responded to the first of the invaders, by trying to kill them and drive them off. And that continued well into the 20th century. So that when we remember the massacres of Aboriginal people, we also have to honour the Aboriginal people and said that they were prepared to fight and die to hold on to their land. So much of what's become Australian history is about wars claiming that that's what our soldiers were trying to do. Why is it not that we can honour Aboriginal people for wanting to do the same things? And being smart enough to know that there are plenty of occasions where they couldn't go head to head, so they drive the sheep off a cliff. They knew how to hit the pastoralists and the squatters in their hip pockets. So we need to look for a red band history, not looking for victims everywhere, but for people who were struggling. And that's true for all the issues in the working class and for women. The situation now that at least 50% of union members in Australia are women. It's a huge change in the last 50 years. And what that means, I think, is we've got to rethink the kinds of stories we tell and the ways in which we tell them. Not just a matter of finding women who were great union leaders or great activists in the past. We need to do that. But we have to think the way in which that material is presented. Many of us grew up thinking that raising a left clenched fist was a good way of indicating the strength of the labour movement. We have to ask ourselves now as to how people who are outside the labour movement, young women who we're trying to attract, what do they see when they see a clenched fist? Is it a very appealing symbol? Do we perhaps need clasped hands or a rose? I don't know the answer to that, but these are some of the things we've got to think about as we try and carry what we understand as the images of the labour movement forward. We have to think, of course, about the place of women when they were not in the paid workforce, long before they were 50% of the union movement, and weave that into the history as well. Make an important part of that domestic labour. Now, the activist part of it also means, as I've been saying, as we look at history riding through into the present, to think of how we understand the current economic crisis and how our political responses are going to be to that. Think about the 1890s depression, the 1930s depression, and now. What's it going to be like in the depression of the 2010s? Well, one of the lessons that we can learn very easily is that in the 30s, the ruling class had a campaign slogan, equality of sacrifice. Everyone would have 10% taken off their income. What this meant was that an arbitration court judge lost £300 a year, which was 6 times the amount that an old age pensioner got. So you could keep 6 old age pensioners and the judge still had £2,700 a year. Now, we have to be very careful that we don't get sold another bill of goods of that kind this time around. They won't use phrases like equality of sacrifice. There are spin merchants out there working at them already as to what the next lot is going to be. We have to think about the relative position of our class at the moment. It was devastated in the 1890s. It was weak at the beginning and virtually all organisation disappeared and didn't build up again until well into the 20th century. The 1930s, the labour movement was very weak at the end of 1929. It had been destroyed in some major strikes. But it was able to rebuild from 1934 onwards with the Wonthaggi strike And so by 1937, there were left and communist leaderships in most of the major union areas in Australia. And that was also part of the great struggle against war and fascism of the 1930s. We have to ask ourselves, where would we start to rebuild today? There was an American speaker at an event that Kim had organised at the museum in Canberra, and he was pointing to the American situation. He said they may well be back there to the position where they have no paid officials at all. And they have to go back to the period in which the labour movement was first being brought together, in which everybody was an organiser. You joined the union and that made you an organiser, and you organised other people. And that should be the case all the time anyway. But we need to be prepared to face up to those things that come out of it. Because out of the response to the Depression, not just here but around the world in the 1890s, then the First World War and the mass slaughter, then to the rise of fascism in the 20s into the 30s, the Second Great Depression, and then another World War, capitalism was on the nose. It was not a good brand label, which is why you don't hear them talking about themselves as capitalists very often. So during the 1940s, the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States spent millions of dollars coming up with a new brand label, road testing it around America. And the answer they came up with, the new name, was free enterprise. These were the two most appealing terms to people. So we can see them out there working again in these kinds of ways as the system now falls apart. Initially, the first thing is to say, push it on the basis of greed, as if there are just a few greedy people out there. Been one kind of line of defence. The other aspect of this, of course, is about war.